let's say 1774, 1773, the British decided to build a road into Florida to bring tourists in there, because the British wanted to settle their lands, and everybody had bugged out after the Spanish left. So the British were desperate to get settlers, and they built a road that connected to Savannah. There was a road called the Georgia Post Road that ran south from Savannah, and at the Florida border, at the St. Mary's River, they started construction on what they called the Kings Road, the Kings Highway, which today we call Old Kings. And people get utterly confused between Old Kings and the Dixie Highway, which are hundreds of years apart. But the Old Kings was one of the first highways built in Florida, and it remained as the main entry highway into Florida right up into 1920s. Everything happened on Old Kings because, let me get into slavery for just a moment. We had all these plantations run by absentee owners. Some would have as many as 300 slaves, like Bunnell. This was a very dangerous place for Caucasians. You had terrible diseases. You had malaria. You had yellow fever. You had all sorts of things. And if you were down here, your chances of dying was pretty good. So they ran them by remote control. In other words, these plantations were managed by the slaves. The chemists were slaves. The steam engine operator was a slave. The engineers were slaves. The carpenters, the shipwrights, all of the skilled craftsmen here in Flagler County were slaves. And they pretty much built the county. Now, there's no record of this. Was anything written down? No, there's a guy by the name of Bill Ryan wrote some books. And I wrote a book called Osceola. Now, Osceola was here, and he was the leader of the Black Seminoles, because for hundreds of years, when a slave escaped from a Georgia or Carolina plantation, and they did escape, they didn't go north. The railway didn't run north. It ran south down Old Kings Road into Florida. And this is where they ended up. And so there were black families here for hundreds of years, living with the Indians, living with the Seminole Indians. Because remember, these slaves were expert craftsmen. Number one, they spoke English, which the Indians did not. Number two, most of them were skilled workers. They were woodworkers, they were engineers, they were chemists, and they would show up here in Florida working with the Indians. So this all went bluey. You see, we had a guy by the name of Andrew Jackson got elected President of the United States. Andrew got the Indian Removal Act passed, and this said that all Indians in the United States would be shipped west of the Mississippi River. The only catch-22, they failed to define what an Indian was. So an Indian was anyone with black skin or dark skin that owned land that you wanted to grab. And that's exactly what happened. We had the so-called Trail of Tears in Georgia, where thousands of people died. But the Seminoles were a little different. The Seminole Nation declared war on the United States. And this war began Christmas Eve, 1835, declared war. And bluey, I mean, this was gone with the wind on steroids. All of these plantations ended up being burned, destroyed. Most of Florida was wrecked. This war was identical with Vietnam, identical. In fact, I have a paper written by a general at the military school who compared. He said, if we had read the accounts of the Seminole War, we may never have gone into Vietnam. He said the two wars were essentially identical. And so now we're looking for Old Kings Road here. We're coming up on the plantation or some of the different places. And here you really have to use your imagination, because keep in mind that we didn't have all these trees We didn't have all this brush here. These were cleared fields. These were cleared fields with growing sugar cane, growing cotton, growing indigo, which is a dye. They were being managed by slaves. They were running the place. I was fascinated by a survey of Bulow where I found they had 160 slaves in residence and 2 Caucasians, one of which was a cook. Who do you think was running the place? It wasn't the Caucasians. They weren't here. So we're going to turn, we're right opposite Halifax Plantation, and Old Kings Road, once upon a time, ran right through Halifax Plantation. The location was on the power lines today, and it ran down to a ferry on the Tomoka River. There was a ferry boat there. But this, we happen to know, is the authentic, real route of Old Kings Road. Now, you're on treasured ground right now. Use your imagination. Think that you're on a stagecoach. 1774. They had daily stagecoach service. This was a nice paved road, a paved highway. You had Concord stagecoaches, maybe pulled by 4 horses. You could send a letter from Calford, which is today Jacksonville, down to New Smyrna in one day. Today it takes 4 to 6 days for the same letter. But you're on it right now. This is the actual Old Kings Road. If you use your imagination and look left and look right, these trees weren't here. These were cleared, open fields. We had something called the task system because the plantations were essentially managed by slaves. The task was this: if you had a 40-acre field, your task was to maintain that 40-acre field. When your work was done, you were free to sell your time or labor to an adjacent planter for money. Or you could do whatever you wanted to do. You could plant a garden, you could have a shotgun, you could have a boat, you could go hunting and fishing, and that's exactly what went on. Now, I don't want to paint any bright picture of slavery, because it wasn't bright. But I'm just saying it was different. Down here, it wasn't what you read in, who was it? Something about Briar Rabbit or something like that. But it was very, very different. And this, you're going by the cleared fields right now. These were the great plantation fields of Bulow, Pellisier, going all the way down to the Tomoka River, right here. And you're right in the middle of this great swamp. Today they're gated communities, they're houses, they're highly developed, but it wasn't always this way. There once was a great industrial revolution here, a lot of industry. Now, one of the largest slave revolts that ever occurred in the United States was never documented. It happened right here. And if you want to find the authentication, there is a website called johnhorse.com. This is all one word, JOHNHORSE.com. It's the University of Texas. It's the most complete website ever done on the slave revolt that happened right here. The slaves went in conjunction with the Seminole Indians. When the Seminoles declared war, you had the black Seminoles, and they were led by a guy by the name of Osceola. I think maybe you heard that name before. But Osceola was a leader. Whoops, we just went by the road there. That was the entry to the Bulow ruins. And if you ever get a chance to come here again, go down that narrow road. That road is much older than the Bulow plantation. Bulow was built in 1821 when the United States took over Florida again. But that road is much older, and it once ran all the way to the beach. It's called the Beach Road. There was a bridge across the creek, and the Bulow is still the spookiest, most authentic place you're ever going to find in Florida. I recommend that you go to Bulow, wander about and meditate. because if you want to feel time, that's the place to do it. It's there. This was an immense mill. It was an immense sugar mill. We've got a story of an Indian princess. We've got all sorts of tales and stories, which if you want to know more, you've got to buy my books. And they're available on Amazon. See, I get those commercials there. But they're all different stories. On the right here, this is still Bulow. Some of these raised land, you see pieces of dirt that are in the air, or these might have been rice fields. But in any event, these were all growing fields run by the Bulow plantation, right here, right where we're at right now. And we're on Old Kings Road. It's a little hard to show you these things because in 400 years, a few things happen. We get a developer comes along with a bulldozer. We've had all these plantations, and not many of them survived. But Christmas Eve, 1835, the Seminoles declared war, and it was a very nasty, dirty war. It was awful. And there lies some stories. But you are on Old Kings Road right now, and this is the original road. Now we're going to go a little bit further here. We're going to cross again the Dixie Highway, which today is called Moody Boulevard. We're going to go straight because we're going to find a cemetery that I think no one knows is there. It's called the Masonic Cemetery. It is an African American cemetery, still very much in use. It is quite old. It has thousands and thousands of graves in it. And the Masonic Cemetery traces its roots back to the Masonic Order, the African American Masonic Order in Boston in 1776. The first person killed in the American Revolution was a black man by the name of Christopher Attacus, and he was a member of the Masons in Boston. So this Masonic group traces its lineage back to this. As I said, this is an African American cemetery that's been here for quite a while, and no one knows it's here. If we could find it, it's a very difficult turn in. I might add that these were all plantations on your right and left. This is all plantation land, every bit of this. Now, there were ancient Indians here too. We've found mounds and relics that have been dated between 2,000 to 3,000 years. The ancient Indians lived here. The only way to equate this in your mind, in the Bible, during the time of Moses, there were Indian towns right here, right where we're at. And they didn't live in teepees like John Wayne. They lived in towns with houses, with buildings. They had roads, which were these coquina ridges, which are the relics of the ancient ocean. And in that lies another story. But in any event, there have been people here for a very long time. Did the Seminoles know the ancient Indians? No, they did not. When the white people arrived, when we said Columbus arrived, he brought diseases, and they had these terrible diseases that decimated the early Indians. And of course, they died. So when the Seminoles appeared, now there's no such thing as a Seminole, by the way. These were Indian tribes that were chased into Florida by the many European wars going on to the north. We called them Creeks, Upper Creek or Lower Creek, but they weren't really. They were tribes like the Miccosukes or the Hitachis, they all had names. And they had different languages. They didn't even like each other. So they ended up down here, and eventually they called them Cimarron, which in Spanish meant stranger or visitor. And eventually they adopted the name themselves and called themselves Seminoles. But they really weren't. They were all different tribes speaking different languages. And as I said, in many cases, they didn't even like each other. They got even with us, though.